Hello, my name is Dr. Rebecca Grant and I'm Head of Data and Software Publishing at F1000. In this presentation, I'll outline the STM Association's guidance on selecting and implementing a research data sharing policy for academic journals. Research data can help to advance scholarship, and journals have a key role to play by contextualizing published data and increasing access to it. This guide builds on a framework for journal data policies developed by the Research Data Alliance and published in 2020. While there are endless variations in research data policy requirements, the framework suggests choosing one of 6 potential policy templates, which vary by strength and what is expected of authors. Differences across the policies include the requirements for where datasets are stored, the licenses that may be applied, and whether authors are required to include a data availability statement as a section of their submitted manuscript. The resources provided by the STM Association will help to guide you through the process of selecting and implementing a journal policy, which will best suit the needs of your journal, editorial team, and authors. This process will take into account the journal's disciplinary focus and the resources available to monitor compliance after the policy has been implemented. There is a document accompanying this video which goes into more detail on selecting and implementing a journal data policy, which can be found online at the STM Association's Research Data Programme website. The table reproduced on this slide shows 6 potential policy templates based on 14 different criteria, and whether or not the policy provides information or provides information and requires action. You can see that if you chose policy level 1 for your journal, your authors would not be required to include data availability statements in their manuscripts, and data sharing is not mandatory. But policy level 6 includes multiple requirements, including data peer review. There are 6 key questions which can help you to establish which data sharing policy may be right for your journal. Considering these questions in turn will assist you in identifying your journal community's readiness for data sharing, what expectations currently exist regarding data sharing practices from within the community, and what your authors might consider to be data in their own research practice. Once you've identified the status of data sharing in the journal's disciplinary community, you can decide whether data sharing should be mandated or whether an encouragement for data sharing would be more appropriate. You can then decide how you expect the journal's authors to demonstrate that they've complied with the policy and shared their data. Finally, you will need to consider the journal's resourcing and how you expect to support authors and to monitor compliance with the data sharing policy. We'll now look at each of these questions in more detail. Identifying existing community or disciplinary data standards can help you to establish the extent to which your journal's authors may already be familiar with data sharing and are likely to have had previous experience with sharing their data. If you're not sure whether there are existing standards in a community or discipline, fairsharing.org is a useful place to start your research. Fair Sharing collects information about existing standards, metadata schema, reporting guidelines, data repositories, and journal data policies, and is searchable by keyword. Using a search for your journal's discipline, you may find that there are numerous standards and policies in place already, and many established data repositories available. This might lead you to choose a more stringent data sharing policy for your journal, as the community are more likely to have encountered data sharing and data policies before. You can also search for journal titles and see what type of policies similar journals have in place. If you find that another journal has a data policy in place which might also be appropriate for your journal, you could map its requirements to the RDA policy framework, which provides openly licensed policy templates that you can reuse. It may seem surprising, but many researchers will not automatically know what you mean when you ask them to share their data. Definitions of research data can also vary widely depending on the discipline. For example, a geneticist's idea of data will not be the same as an historian's. You should establish what you think research data might include for authors publishing at your journal. It can be helpful to provide examples to authors who may be unsure. You should also consider what categories of data you might be used or created by your authors and what you will ask them to do with it. For example, you may require that all primary data that underpins the findings of the research paper should be uploaded to a data repository and shared openly, but that other supporting materials like survey instruments or charts can be uploaded as supplementary files. Generally speaking, journal data policies will only require authors to share the research data that are necessary to validate or replicate the reported findings, not the entire output of a research project. When thinking about how the data should be shared, for example with peer reviewers or future readers, you should take into account storage, licensing, and whether you will allow authors to put embargoes in place before the data is shared. These three choices are interconnected, so you must ensure that the option you choose is logical and easy for your authors to follow. Data storage and sharing methods are a key element of data policies. Some methods of data sharing will create more work upfront for the author, for example, sharing data in a repository, while others will create ongoing obligations for the author over time, for example, sharing data when requested by a reader. Best practice for data sharing is to upload data to a repository, ideally one that's related to the author's research discipline or community. Using data repositories allows data to be found and accessed more easily, preserves the data over time, and provides persistent identifiers to allow the data to be cited. As previously mentioned, fairsharing.org or alternatively re3data.org are excellent ways to identify whether there are existing disciplinary data repositories that your authors may already be using. If there's no disciplinary repository available for a particular discipline or data type, you may direct authors to use a generalist repository. These repositories usually accept any type of data, regardless of the discipline or type. Disciplinary repositories are preferable as they'll support specific data standards appropriate for certain data types and create a central location for all data from a discipline to be found. However, many disciplines do not yet have specific data repositories available, and generalist repositories are a well-used alternative option. Some journals will allow authors to upload their data as supplementary files during the submission process. While this method still provides access to the data to readers, it will be less discoverable than data in a repository and cannot be cited separately to the research article. If you choose to allow authors to use the sharing method, you may also consider working with a data repository to push supplementary files into the repository with accompanying metadata records. Alternatively, you may decide to allow authors to store their data locally and to provide access to readers only when they are asked to do so. While this sharing method is relatively well established across disciplines, there is a risk that authors will refuse to respond to requests or lose access to their own data over time, a phenomenon which is already well documented. Next, if you're mandating the use of data repositories, you may consider defining the terms under which the data should be shared. You can do this by requiring a particular license to be applied to the dataset. Ideally, you should choose one which promotes reuse and supports the principles of openness, such as CC0 or CC BY. Both permit reuse of the data by anyone for any purpose. As the license will be applied to the dataset in the repository, you will need to check that any repository you recommend to your authors supports the license that you're requiring them to apply. Finally, you will need to decide whether you will allow your authors to embargo the data, for example, close it for a certain period of time. This decision should take into account the norms in your journal's discipline and whether there may be any related funder data policies which would be in conflict with your journal's policy. Perhaps the most important element of your chosen data policy will be its strength. Are you requiring all authors to share data and rejecting authors who do not share? Or are you encouraging data sharing and allowing authors to publish regardless of whether their data has been shared or not? This is a decision which might be influenced by some of the previous questions you have addressed. Whether you feel that your journal's disciplinary community is ready for data sharing, and whether there are appropriate standards and repositories already available for your authors to use. You should also begin thinking about compliance and support. What would happen if your authors did not immediately become compliant with your data sharing policy? Realistically, would you reject these articles? what kind of support could you provide to help authors to understand the new requirements? Additionally, you should consider policy coverage and whether the same policy should apply to every article type in the journal. Policy exemptions will also be important, particularly if your authors work with sensitive subjects, for example, human research participants. When you've decided on what you expect your authors to do with their data, you will need to think about how they will demonstrate that their data have been shared appropriately. This will be important for the team reviewing incoming submissions to ensure that the journal's policy has been complied with, but also for peer reviewers and future readers who may wish to access the data. There are two key mechanisms for authors to use to highlight the data connected to their article, and ideally both should be used in every published article with associated data. Firstly, data availability statements are a short, narrative section of a research paper which can be used to provide rich and detailed information about the dataset underpinning the research. Authors should use this section to describe all of the datasets associated with the article, their locations, for example, a link to the repository where they're stored, and licensing terms. If there are any conditions around accessing the dataset, they can also be described in this section. Secondly, data citations should be used to refer to any datasets discussed in the body of the article, and datasets should be included in the reference list. These can be included in the existing reference list or bibliography, or in a separate standalone list of related datasets if preferred. The use of data citations allows machine-readable connections to be made between research articles and datasets, improving the discoverability of both. Requiring data citation also ensures that data creators are credited for their work and raises the status of datasets to that of other bibliographic citations, further encouraging data sharing. STM has a separate guide for publishers about data availability statements and data to literature linking via Scholix on the Research Data Programme webpage. As previously mentioned, supporting authors and monitoring compliance with the new policy will be key to transitioning your journal to data sharing. In particular, if you're mandating data sharing and the use of repositories, you should ensure that authors are informed of the new requirements and are able to access help if they're unsure what it means for them. An overview of the policy requirements should be added to the journal's instructions for authors, and you may choose to flag the policy within the manuscript submission system as well, if possible. Whether you offer a help desk or another means of answering authors' questions, you should aim to respond as quickly as possible to avoid delaying your submissions. As well as your journal's authors, you should aim to inform your editors, and in some cases peer reviewers, that they have new obligations related to research data. Aside from the initial check for policy compliance, for example, to ensure that the author did share some data related to the submitted manuscript, you may consider some additional checks, for example, to ensure that what has been shared is genuinely related to the research being described. Depending on the resources available, you may wish to prompt the editorial team or the peer reviewers to make an assessment of the completeness and quality of the dataset, whether it could be reused by others, and the extent to which the shared data would support validation or replication of the claims being made in the article. The depth of the expected checks can help you to plan for the support that your editorial team or peer reviewers may need to implement the policy. Some may require additional training on assessing data and data sharing methods. It's important to acknowledge that there will be some scenarios where authors cannot comply with your new data sharing policy, so you must decide whether you'll include policy exceptions to allow these authors to publish in your journal. For example, many researchers work with human research participants and generate sensitive data, which includes personally identifiable information. While your journal might require data to be shared in a repository, you should not prompt your authors to share sensitive data openly and risk their participants being identified. You will need to decide whether you will allow an exception to your policy, for example, to allow sensitive data to be shared on request or only via a controlled access repository. Similarly, some authors may not be able to apply an open license to their data, for example, if they're in the process of applying for a patent. You may choose to waive any open licensing requirements if the author can provide evidence that they cannot comply with them. If authors are using policy exceptions to avoid open data sharing, they should, at a minimum, provide an explanation for the lack of sharing in their data availability statement. This image represents a simplified overview of the manuscript submission process and includes the steps where you may wish to make changes during the implementation of your new journal data policy. At pre-submission, you need to communicate the data policy to potential authors and ensure that there is clear guidance available to assist them in complying. This will generally require a change to the journal's existing submission guidelines or information for authors pages, which are usually available on the journal website. To support submission, the journal's manuscript submission process should ideally be updated to remind authors of any data sharing requirements and to allow them to include a data availability statement. If possible, you should also provide functionality that would allow the author to share a link to their dataset with the peer reviewer. Immediately following submission, the Journal Editorial Office, or JEO, should be prepared to undertake policy compliance checks. This can involve checking that a data availability statement has been included and that any links provided to data repositories resolve to a live website. Once the manuscript has been sent for peer review, you may expect the peer reviewers to review the data. To support this process, you can update the peer reviewer form to highlight the manuscript's data availability statement and any links out to datasets. You should also update any peer reviewer guidance to indicate what checks or assessment you expect them to undertake. During production, the data availability statement and any data citations need to be marked up in the XML. So this will need to be flagged with the relevant team to update their workflow. Finally, once the manuscript has been published, the information on shared data should be sent to Crossref as part of the metadata. This allows links between the data and literature to be surfaced via the Scholix framework. Overall, the practical aspects of data policy implementation can be broken down into 3 areas: communication, training, and technology. Communication with authors and reviewers will be key to informing them of the new policy requirements. As well as outlining what's required, you can also share template data availability statements that they can reuse and examples of data citations. It can be helpful to summarize key points of the policy, outlining exactly what is required in order to comply and to publish in your journal. If this is the journal's first data sharing policy or the change in policy is substantial, you should also work closely with your editorial board to ensure that they understand why the policy is important and can work with you to support author compliance. In most cases, the journal team will need training and guidance to understand and support the new data policy. This will be important to ensure that compliance checks are being completed and that support is offered to any authors who are unsure of what is needed. Also consider that the stronger the policy is, the more time will be needed to monitor compliance. It's quicker to check that a data availability statement exists than to navigate to a disciplinary data repository and check which license has been applied to a dataset. You'll also need to make changes to the technology that you use to manage article submissions, and this may be easier or more difficult depending on which manuscript submission system your journal uses and what technical support is available to you. If possible, you should update the system to specifically capture data availability statements and data citations if they are required by your policy. You may also wish to highlight the availability of data to editors and reviewers if this functionality exists in your system. As previously mentioned, your production team will need to mark up data availability statements and data citations using the tags available in the industry standard JATS markup. You can find further guidance on this in our other video on the STM Research Data Programme page. So the link to the STM Association's Research Data Programme website is on the slide, and if you did have any further questions, please do contact the STM team.